Who would have thought that one day Chad would completely break off diplomatic relations with France? Honestly, nobody, least of all France, saw that coming. But this is the reality on the ground right now. Recently, the authorities in Chad announced that Chad has ended its defense cooperation pact with France. This move follows the moves made by the other countries in the Sahel region, and it is yet another blow to France's influence in Africa. The question is, why did Chad make this decision? And what is the reaction of France? Let's find out. On Thursday, November 28, 2024, the government of Chad announced that it has ended its defense cooperation pact with France. This simply means that the French troops in Chad will have to leave the country. In the statement released by Chad's foreign ministry, the government revealed that although Chad has been a key Western ally in the fight against Islamic militants in the region, it plans to fully assert its sovereignty after more than 6 decades of independence. In other words, since independence, Chad has not been able to assert its full independence because of France's influence in the country. You see, Chad has been the linchpin of France's geopolitical strategy in Central Africa since it gained independence. Its strategic location made it a perfect place for France to police its former colony, important for its status as one of the world's most developed countries. Chad has been a favorite region for French military interventions and serves as a barometer of France's commitment to its African clients. For example, in the 1960s and 1970s, France intervened to support Chadian government forces fighting Florinert. In 1982, Chad President Hissène Habré came to power with French support. And when Idriss Déby overthrew Habré and took power, France did not intervene but supported him, supporting him for 38 years until his death. France was also responsible for helping the son, who is now the president of Chad, to seize power after the death of his father in a military coup. So if we look at the history of Chad since independence, French presence and intervention is always there. The reason is that France attaches great importance to Chad due to its strategic location. From there, it monitors the Sahel and Sahara regions and sends its military forces for intervention throughout the region. Chad's position as a key ally of France was further strengthened after a wave of coups spread throughout the Sahel and even into Burkina Faso, Niger, and Mali, leading to the expulsion of French troops from these countries. Before we proceed, here is a reminder to like this video, drop a comment, and subscribe to our channel so that you can get more videos like this. Now, the expulsion of French troops made Chad the last country in the region to receive French troops, further increasing its importance to France. This is because the French deployment in Chad helped demonstrate French military power in the Sahel and also conveyed the image of France being the leading power on the continent. Unfortunately for France, this gave leverage to the Chadian government, meaning that France no longer had much influence in Chad, and the Chadian government could do whatever it wanted, including the opposite of what France wanted. This was made clear in early 2022, when France insisted that President Déby remove himself from the presidential elections and appoint Success Masra as prime minister. However, Déby refused and France could do nothing as there was a risk that Chad would expel the French troops from the country, which France wanted to avoid at all costs. Moreover, Chad's strategic importance to France now means that France must definitely support Chad if it wants to stay in the country. Moreover, anti-French sentiment is widespread in Chad, as in Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso. There are now growing calls among Chadians, as well as among the country's political elite, for French troops to withdraw completely from the country. A coalition of activists, including the Waikato Tama movement, said they would organize protests if France does not begin to withdraw its troops by the end of 2023. These activists and political elites point to France's double standards, which supported the unconstitutional presidential seizure of power after the death of his father, and that France launched deadly airstrikes against rebels in Chad in 2019 when their purpose was supposed to be fighting terrorism. This means that resentment against the French army could make it easier for rebels within the regime to rally against President Déby, and that whoever takes power will surely not be a friend of the French people. It's no wonder then that the president of Chad was able to comfortably fly to Moscow to have an exclusive meeting with President Putin. On January 24th, Russian President Vladimir Putin hosted Chadian Transitional President Mahamat Idriss Déby on his official visit to Moscow. President Déby's visit to Russia marks the second trip by any Chadian president since it gained independence from France, and the first official visit to Moscow by a Chadian leader in 56 years. However, this doesn't mean that Chad had completely cut off relations with Russia before now. During the last Russia-Africa summit, Chad's president was supposed to attend the summit, but because of the pressure from the West, he had to be represented by Foreign Minister Mohammad Saleh Anadif. Also, during the first Russia-Africa summit in 2019, President Déby's father attended the summit as Chad's head of state. Now, this recent meeting between President Déby and President Putin addressed the prospects for further developing Russian-Chadian relations in various fields as well as regional and international issues. According to a transcript published on the Kremlin website, Putin said that the two countries had great opportunities to develop our bilateral ties, and that Moscow would double the quota for Chadian students studying at Russian universities. Now, it was from this point that the world began to realize that Chad was gradually shifting away from France. But nobody thought that the government would end up breaking away completely. However, this is exactly what is happening right now. In the statement released on social media, Chad stated that the government of the Republic of Chad informs the national and international community about the termination of the agreement on defense cooperation with France signed on September 5, 2019. In accordance with the terms of the accord, Chad will respect the modalities of the termination, including the necessary deadlines, and will collaborate with French authorities to ensure a harmonious transition, the statement further added. Chad's move comes as a shocking blow to France because on the same day the statement was released, France's Foreign Minister, Jean-Noël Barrot, had paid a visit to the Chadian border. According to the reports, there was no indication that Chad wanted to end the defense agreement with France, and Chad did not give France advance notice of the decision. Chad currently has about 1,000 troops as well as warplanes stationed in Chad, which will be expected to leave the country in the coming months. Now, following the announcement by the Chadian authorities, France said on November 29th that it has taken note of Chad's decision to its defense cooperation with Paris and would now work with it to implement the decision. The statement, which came 24 hours after Chad's government announced the decision, said Paris had already been working on reconfiguring its African military presence for 2 years. The interesting thing is that Chad's decision follows that of the statement made by Senegal's President Diomaye Faye. On the same day Chad ended its defense cooperation with France, Senegal's President Bassirou Diomaye Faye urged France to shut down its military bases in Senegal. The announcement comes as Senegal prepares to commemorate the 80th anniversary of a notorious colonial-era massacre. Interestingly, on the same day, French President Emmanuel Macron acknowledged for the first time that the French army was responsible for the massacre of Senegalese soldiers in 1944. President Macron made this known in a letter addressed to the Senegalese authorities. There is no doubt that the only reason France is acknowledging this as a massacre is because France is losing influence in Africa. France currently has 350 troops in Senegal, and although the president didn't say when they should leave, there is no doubt that plans are currently underway to kick them out. This is remarkable. Finally, African countries are growing the backbone to stand up against their former colonizers. And it all started with the waves of coup in Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso. Indeed, the end of Francafrique is here. Recall that earlier this year, French President Emmanuel Macron made one of the most surprising statements during his tour of 4 African countries to repair broken ties. The era of Francafrique is over. And now, just a few months later, his prophecy has come true. Perhaps not in the way he imagined, but the end of Francafrique, the name used to describe France's long colonial presence in Africa, is here. The term Francafrique was first coined in 1955 by Félix Houphouët-Boigny, the first president of Côte d'Ivoire, to describe the close ties between Africa and France. Unlike other colonial powers that reduced their presence in Africa after independence, France maintained its presence on the continent through political, economic, and security ties to protect its interests. In fact, France's actions over the years suggest that it considered its former colonies as its own backyard. The colonial agreements concluded between France and Francophone Africa ensured that France would continue to maintain its relations with these countries. Although some French presidents have tried to change their policies towards Africa, and move away from domination-oriented policies, old habits persist, especially when it comes to protecting French interests, which are centered around energy and raw materials that can only be found in Africa. They are easy to find and obtain. They do this by influencing African internal politics and ensuring that African leaders who are corrupt but represent African interests remain in power. For example, during the 2009 Gabonese presidential election, France allowed Ali Bongo to commit voter fraud and ensured his victory by giving him the same support as his father, Omar, an oil wealth grabber and anti-democrat. This is just one example of how France has influenced corrupt African leaders. These African leaders provided French companies with access to vital resources such as diamonds, ore, uranium, gas, and oil in exchange for military support and huge bribes against attempted coups. As a result, France has a strong presence on the African continent, boasting 1,100 companies and about 2,100 subsidiaries, making it the third largest investment portfolio after the UK and the US. Also, in the name of counterterrorism, France has established a significant military presence in Africa, especially in the Sahel region. Take, for example, the French-led military counterterrorism operation, the so-called Operation Barkhane, which began in Mali in 2013. For 9 years, France, despite all its military might and high-quality equipment, was unable to put an end to the rebellion problem and remained in Mali and maintained its base. Doesn't this indicate that France's military presence may be just a means to protect its own interests in the Sahel region? In fact, France's continued presence and influence in French-speaking countries has not done much to solve people's problems, such as violence, poverty, lack of economic opportunities, poor education systems, and poor infrastructure. Ironically, these former French colonies are the poorest by African standards, despite being the richest in natural resources. So should France be surprised that anti-French sentiment has spread so widely and rapidly across Africa recently? In recent years, anti-French sentiment has grown and become strong enough to have caused a wave of coups across Africa. The first was in Mali in 2020, when current President Assimi Goïta seized power. Of course, France and other regional countries condemned the coup, but the military junta refused to back down. The situation ended when Mali terminated its military and defense agreement with France and asked all French troops to leave the country. But that was not all. The French ambassador to Mali was ordered to leave the country, French media was suspended, and French was no longer an official language in Mali. The Mali coup seemed to be a model for all the other coups that followed. In Burkina Faso, the military junta also drove out the French. As in Mali, Burkina Faso's President Ibrahim Traoré has scrapped a military agreement that allowed French troops to fight terrorists on its territory, saying the country would defend itself. The trend remains the same in Niger, where a coup took place in 2023. The military seized power and overthrew former President Mohamed Bazoum, who is known as a French ally. As in Mali and Burkina Faso, the military junta did not surrender despite sanctions and threats of war. She also ordered the departure of the French ambassador from Niger. While the world was still watching the situation in Niger, another coup took place in Gabon, another former French colony that had been ruled for 55 years by a corrupt family dynasty and close French allies. The military seized power shortly after Gabon's president Ali Bongo Ondimba was re-elected. Bongo and his father had ruled the country for 55 years and amassed vast fortunes through corruption. As always, France did not hesitate to express its dissatisfaction. French government spokesman Olivier Véran said, "France condemns the military coup in Gabon and is closely monitoring developments in the country. France reiterates its hope that the results of the elections will be respected once they are known. Whatever they say, the coup has happened, and it is likely to follow the same pattern as previous coups." In all these coups so far, the people of each country showed considerable excitement. In Mali and Burkina Faso, for example, after the coup, hundreds of demonstrators took to the streets to express anti-French sentiment. They held up placards that read, "Down with France." Burkina Faso citizens went even further and destroyed the French embassy. All these events show that Africans are tired of the constant French interference in the African continent and no longer accept the previous situation, where France considers it a personal deposit of resources. Interestingly, Africans are not the only ones who know this fact. In response to the attempted coup that spread across the continent, a group of senators, joined by 94 representatives of different political parties, sent an open letter to French President Emmanuel Macron, highlighting France's diplomatic failure in Africa and calling for a review of the country's policies on the continent. According to them, after the failure of Operation Balkan, a wave of anti-French sentiment swept through many West African countries, whose leaders stayed in power by uniting their people against their former colonial masters, reporting that he also referred to Algerian President Abdelmadjid Tebboune, because sometimes he spoke of peace with France, but sometimes he considered France the devil, the source of all evil. The parliamentarians stressed that they are not nostalgic for the colonial era and do not dream of French West Africa or French Equatorial Africa, and expressed their dissatisfaction with the development of France's African policy in the fields of military, development cooperation, and culture. The senators then stressed that it is time to rethink France's view of Africa and its relations with the continent, stressing that they want France to maintain strong and warm relations with Africa in many areas of common interest. It remains to be seen whether President Macron will listen to their voice, but Francophone Africa is on a path to unstoppable success. These countries are aware that they can stand up and fight against colonialism and imperialism. The end of Francafrique is here and it cannot be stopped. As the Prime Minister of Senegal once said, more than 60 years after our independence, we must question the reasons why the French army, for example, still benefits from several military bases in our country and the impact of this presence on our national sovereignty and our strategic autonomy. He went on to reference how on 2 occasions France refused to entertain the idea of a U.S. military base in the country and justified the decision by saying that France had the will and right to dispose of a will that is incompatible with a defense organization in which it will be subordinated. So, if France can oppose setting up a military base in its country, it means that African countries can do the same. And this is exactly what is happening. Indeed, the era of France's influence in Africa is over. What are your thoughts? Let us know in the comments section below. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video.